that underlie it. I just want to kind of go over some of the tools and things and stuff that I have on hand. You know, I like to have a variety of containers when for collecting seeds, either when I'm collecting on a property, or if I'm collecting even from my own property or from the nursery itself. A selection of envelopes for dry type seeds, and plastic bags and medicine bottles are good too, for collecting fruits and, you know, seeds that are kind of on the damp side. And of course, I like to make sure I've got plenty of pencils and pens and Sharpies with me, because it's no good collecting seeds if you can't remember what they are later. So make sure that everything is well labeled for when you go out and do your collecting. Now, when you get them back to your house, I've got a number of things I like to use for processing seed to clean it down, so get rid of all the chaff, and to make sure that I've got reasonably clean seed that I can then put into more permanent packing or sowing. That's just a aluminum mixing bowl, and these are these are pizza plates here, and a series of sieves and screens that I made out of chicken wire and various other hardware cloths. The sieves are actually scientific sieves that I bought, or you can get online. And you know, depending on the size seed of my collection, I'll use the sieves, or I'll use these hardware cloth things to remove all of the chaff and other non-seed materials, so that I just get the seed itself passing through the sieve, collecting into the bowl beneath, which then allows me to pour them into this little funnel thing that is just a piece of aluminum that's bent, which I can use as a funnel to fill my packets and medicine bottles for longer term storage. Or I can use this to sow the seeds evenly in a flat. Other things I like to have along, of course, particularly when I'm processing seed, a mask, because surprisingly, a lot of seed, when you start rubbing it through the sieves, a lot of dust comes up, and it can be really irritating to your throat and eyes and everything. So I like to wear a mask, and, you know, gloves. You know, there are actually certain seeds that have little hairs and bits that easily stick in your hand. So gloves are good to have too. And then before even I get to the sieves, sometimes it's good to dry seeds down. And generally, seeds that are dry on the plant, you can dry down even further for longer term storage. So I have a whole plastic bin in my barn full of paper lunch bags and grocery bags that I'll just put my collected bulk material into, and I'll leave them in the greenhouse or other dry place with free-flowing air to dry them down further. And then once they're good and crunchy, then that can go into the sieve, and they pass through the sieve really easily. Some considerations when you're collecting and you're thinking about how to process these things. There's a difference, like I said before, between dry seeds and wet seeds. So a dry seed, that's things like echinacea and coreopsis and the grasses and things like that. These are seeds that are dry on the plant. Wet seeds are seeds that are embedded in fruit typically. Think about strawberries and raspberries, or grapes or plums, or service berries, or trilliums, or even things like bloodroot. All of these seeds are damp, and if you let them dry out, they'll lose viability. So dry seeds you can store dry, but wet seeds have to be stored wet. Then you have to consider large, medium, and small seeds. Now that comes down to the sieve that you use. After that, it really is a matter of how you sow them. And of course, that works the same way as it does with vegetables. Small seeds need to be surface sown, and medium and large seeds can be actually buried in your starting medium slightly. Clean seeds that need to be cleaned. that means that basically some seeds actually come off the plant clean. All you need to do is bat them around, and the seeds actually come free from the plant pretty readily. Other seeds are full of a lot of junk that you need to remove, and that includes a lot of the seeds that are embedded in fruit. All the fruit material is going to retard the germination of the plants. It actually has chemicals in the fruit that delay germination. So you want to remove the seed from the fruit. So that's another consideration. Lastly, there are seeds that you can store, whether you store them dry or store them moist and in a refrigerator, but some seeds have to be sown right away. They'll lose viability or they'll be out of sync with the seasons. And so some seeds you can't sit on. As soon as you've collected them, as soon as you've cleaned them, you've got to sow them, or else they're not going to work very well. And then you have to know the plant's dormancy requirements, and that's going to vary as well from plant to plant. But I've kind of broken this lecture into a couple of broad dormancy requirements that I'll get into. Again, things that you need, seeds, storage items. This is more for longer term storage. So the upper left-hand corner, medicine bottles, and those are coin envelopes, work really good for long-term dry seed storage. And those seeds, once they're good and dry, don't even need to be refrigerated. You can store them and then sow them in the autumn or winter when you're ready to sow them. Other seeds will need to be stored cold and wet, which means you need to keep them in your refrigerator until you're ready to actually sow them. And those seeds are often best stored in plastic materials. I've got on the lower right, I'm showing you various kinds of bulk containers, whether it's a mason jar or one of those sort of plastic sauce containers. Medicine bottles, actually, I don't like to use medicine bottles for wet seeds that well. I find that it makes it really hard to clean them for future use. And then, of course, old standby plastic sandwich bags. And then in the lower left, a bin. It's always good to have bins around for storing particularly your dry seeds. I end up collecting upwards of 600 to 800 species of plant every year. And believe me, even in coin packets, that'll fill up a bin full with seeds pretty quickly. Sizes again, this again comes down to storage medium and how you sow the plant. For instance, big seeds like Baptisia and Thalictrum, these are seeds that can be sown in your seed flats, but then you've got to cover them over pretty well to the depth about the thickness of the seed itself in order for them to germinate. But you get into some of these smaller seeds like Rudbeckia and Heliopsis, but even more so, things like Lobelia, and of course the sedges and rushes, very, very tiny seed. And this is seed that basically is sown on the surface of the soil. It cannot be buried at all. Gentian would fall into this category too. And sometimes I'll sow these kinds of seeds on the surface of a seed flat, and then I'll if I bury them at all, it's with milled sphagnum, which I will very, very, very lightly cover over the seeds with. And the thing with milled sphagnum is that a very thin layer of it still lets light through it, lets light get to the seed, which these seeds need for germination often. You don't want to bury them because they're so small that the dark will actually prevent them from germinating. But a little bit of milled sphagnum will keep them moist, bury them a little bit, but still let enough light through to them that they'll actually still germinate well. Fruits, again, I mentioned, you've got to clean this fruit off, and this can be really time consuming. A lot of publications will say put it in a blender. I don't usually do that because I find a blender will often destroy your seeds. Also, it makes a heck of a mess, I find, that I don't want to clean. A couple of things that I will do, I'll actually put them in a mason jar full of water and let them ferment for several weeks. And then once the fruit is fermented and gotten soft, it's really easy to mush and strain through a large opening sieve or a colander. You can just press the seed right through that, and the fruit is left behind, and you can discard that. Other challenges, some seeds, the seed has so much chaff on it, like this Andropogon virginicus, it's mostly fluff. You can't really clean that off very easily. So you almost always end up storing it as is with the fluff and everything with it. That makes it very hard to sow, actually, because that fluff holds the seed kind of up off the ground. The way to deal with that, I have found, is to kind of dress the surface of the soil with the seed and then water it. And then once that fluff gets wet, it kind of adheres to the soil surface. But you've got to work very carefully, because otherwise you'll end up blowing the seed all over the place. Let's see, I think this is a video. Now, some plants have a chaff that is really easy to remove. Let's see, this is a video, I think, so it should play video, play. All right, the video does not want to play, so maybe it's elsewhere. This was supposed to be a video of someone cleaning milkweed seeds using a match. Because the fluff of milkweed is highly flammable, all you need to do is spread the milkweed out on the surface of some hardware cloth and put a match to it, and poof, the chaff just burns away and leaves you clean seed. Real quick and easy. This is actually the chaff of shell-bearing buckwheat. That's the only buckwheat that's native to the East Coast, and the actual seeds are these little hard nuts that are embedded in this papery stuff. And that stuff really doesn't burn very well. I've tried it before, but you can't just burn that paper off. You just kind of got to rub it and rub it and rub it on that sieve until the hard seed actually loosens from the paper and falls through the sieve to the bowl underneath. And then you can just use your breath and just blow that papery chaff right out of the sieve. It'll just blow away. And there it is clean. Those are the actual seeds from the shell-bearing buckwheat after they've passed through the sieve and had the paper removed from them. This is another propagation method. Now, I treat these like seeds, even though they're not seeds. These are actually lily bulbs. These are Canada lily bulbs. And when I go into the spring or whenever I go to divide lily bulbs, I always find that the roots break apart a little bit. They're like these little conglomerations of small little nubs, and they're real fragile. And you can break some of those nubs off. And you can see that on the top there in that the pink tray, all those little broken off nubs of the lily. I will treat those like seeds, and I'll actually sow them in a seed flat like seeds and cover them over, and each of those plants will become a new lily in 2 or 3 years. It takes about 2 or 3 years for them to grow and become a new lily. So this is an asexual propagation method for increasing plants using a technique similar to seed. You're still sowing these things, but they're not seeds. Another thing about seeds, again, is expense. You know, a lot of people want to buy seed, and particularly woodland seed. This is where it gets complicated. You know, a lot of plants that grow in the prairies are real easy to propagate. They're dry, which means you can get a nice packet of them from a seller, and all you gotta do is sow them in your seed flat and let them sit outside all winter. Woodland seed often is more complicated. They can be double dormant, which means it takes more than 1 year for them to germinate. Sometimes they lose viability at seed nurseries because a lot of woodland plants have to be sown right away. And a lot of the seed that comes from woodland plants, there's not as much of it as what is produced by a lot of prairie type plants or meadow plants. You know, think of like a woodland phlox. It produces a very small amount of seed compared to, say, an echinacea, you know, per plant. And those seeds are very hard to collect by comparison. You've got to go out there and collect very small quantities and process it, where unlike echinacea seeds, where you can get a whole lot all at once. Many of these seeds have a very low viability and require special storage requirements or have complicated multi-year germination. So those are some considerations. And I'm going to talk a lot more about woodland plant germination in a way, because the prairie stuff and the meadow plants are pretty simple by comparison. I showed this pet plant, this showy skullcap, as an example of one of the other reasons why it's hard for a lot of people, a lot of nurseries, to sell seeds of woodland plants. A plant like showy skullcap, the seeds ripen in groups of two. The plant blooms from the bottom to the top, and the seeds don't ripen all at the same time. They ripen 2 per week or so. So you've got to go out there and basically, I can only collect 2 seeds every day. And you can imagine the tedium for a nursery person selling seeds of this plant, going out there and hoping that they, you know, collecting the seeds of this. And the moment the plant is, those seeds are ripe, the plant will actually dehisce those seeds, and they'll drop and they'll be gone. So you have to check them every single day, and you may collect half a dozen seeds off a plant every day. But if you don't check every day, then you'll lose them. They'll be gone. So that is another frustration. In some cases, those seeds go spectacularly. Spigelia marilandica seeds just sort of suddenly explode. Like, they're not ripe one day, and then the next day they're ripe. And as soon as they're ripe, those capsules are under pressure, and they will actually open up with a great deal of force and expel the seeds far and wide. I've never actually seen one of these guys do that. They seem to do it when you're not looking. If you look in the lower right-hand side, you can see a brown spot where the seed used to be. Those, and then the upper left-hand corner there, you see the green capsules that aren't quite ripe yet. Eventually, those will turn black. And the moment they turn black and you turn your back on them, they'll pop open and the seeds will be gone. Sometimes seeds will also just sort of disappear. This is Aristolochia serpentaria. And if you look on the left-hand photo, you see that star-shaped object there? That is the seed pod once it opens up, and they just open up randomly. There's no predicting them. You just have to check them every day and see if they're getting ready, but it's very hard to tell when they're ready. You eventually just kind of have to hope that you catch it right when they open, and you can fiddle around with them and see if the capsule is loose or not. And once they start getting kind of ready, you can just collect all of them, because otherwise you're going to lose them. Another thing I find with Aristolochia serpentaria seeds is mice sometimes steal those seed pods. So one day I'll go out there in the morning and I'll find the seed pods have all disappeared. The white-footed mice went and collected them up. Okay, timing and dormancies. So again, they kind of falls into 2 groups. So seeds tend to ripen either in the late spring. That is a lot of our spring plants. You know, think of the bluebells and the bloodroots and things of that nature. And then other plants tend to ripen in the autumn. And a lot of that is your asters and goldenrods and echinaceas and grasses and things like that. So a lot of those plants that ripen up, the seeds ripen in late spring, in June and July, trilliums and such. The seeds ripen kind of irregularly, like I've been talking about, so you got to check on them fairly often to make sure you don't miss them. But also the seeds don't hold on the plant after they ripen. So as soon as they're kind of ripe, you need to collect them. And lastly, the seeds usually have to be sown right away. That's why people often have failures if they're sowing bluebell seeds or Jacob's ladder seeds or even wood poppy seeds in the autumn from someplace. If they've stored those seeds dry, if those seeds have not been properly stored, then they're not going to germinate very well. And I find that even a dry seed like bluebell, if anyone has collected bluebell seeds or Jacob's ladder seeds, it's a dry seed. It's not a seed that's in a fruit the way that trillium seeds are. So you would think that you could store those seeds dry and sow them in the autumn along with all the rest of your seeds. But no, if you sow those seeds in the autumn, they won't work. You have to, if you collect the seeds in June, you should sow those seeds in June. If you collect those seeds in July, you should sow those seeds in July. Now you can get away with that a little bit with trilliums and such. Those seeds you can store, but you have to store them wet and keep them in the refrigerator until the autumn. Then you really can sow them. Basically, you have to treat them as if it's winter time now. And just put them in a little bag full of damp sand or damp soil and put them in your refrigerator. Whereas things like Jacob's ladder and the bluebells, for whatever reason, they seem to need to have that summertime before winter comes on in order to germinate properly. So it's usually best for the Jacob's ladder and the bluebells and the spring phloxes to sow them for the summertime, because they seem to need that summertime period for whatever reason. The autumn ripening seeds are the easy ones. They're the ones that are dry. You can store them dry. You sow them in the autumn or winter. You know, they usually have a 30, 60 day cold requirement, you know, so they need to be outside wet for the winter, or else you need to sow them in little bags of damp sand or potting soil in November and keep them in your refrigerator until the spring. Basically, you have to mimic wintertime one way or another for the fall seeds, either sowing them outdoors in seed flats for the winter or sowing them and keep them in your refrigerator, you know, wet and cold for the winter for springtime sowing. So let's go through some examples. Spring and early summer ripening seeds. A lot of the things I've mentioned already, others I haven't, like Camasius psiloides. That's a plant whose seeds are ripening very soon, usually collecting them in early June. And it's very difficult to find the seeds of this plant once the plant starts setting the seeds, because it doesn't have a lot of top growth. It's basically just a long, thin, strappy stalk, and once it's gone to seed, it's very hard to find in the woods. It has a round, hard seed, kind of like the seeds of allium, but you can actually store those seeds. Since they're dry, you can store them dry. And this is one that you can store dry and sow in the autumn. Seems to do just fine. It's not one that you have to sow in the summertime. But it can't hurt to do that either. Geranium maculatum or Tensia virginica. These are examples of spring ripening seeds that you would do best to sow right away. Don't sit on them. They're dry seeds when you collect them, but they seem to need that summertime in order to germinate properly the following spring. They need that summertime followed by wintertime, followed by the springtime. Same with Jacob's ladder, another one that likes that kind of a sow them as soon as they're ready sort of a situation. Blue woodphlox as well. I had really good luck sowing blue woodphlox this year. Seeds that I sowed in last June came up much better than seeds I held on to and sowed in the winter in the fall. Phlox, again, it's real easy to lose. These are the seeds of the blue wood phlox. And if you look at that stalk, you'll see that most of those have popped already and they're gone, but there's still a few on there that are good. And then you've just got to check on them every day and make your collections until you have enough of them to actually sow. Antonaria and Pechera. These are two things. This is a little bit of a different thing. The seeds ripen in early summer or late spring, but they're in the aster family. And I've noticed that with all of our spring blooming asters, be it Erigeron, be it the Antonaria, be it the Pacera, all of the spring blooming aster family members will, if you sow them right away, they'll actually germinate in a few weeks. They'll germinate come late summer, early autumn. So not only do they prefer to be sown immediately, they're not even going to wait till next spring to germinate. They will germinate right away. And if you hold on to that seed dry and sow it in the winter, they don't seem to do very well. Again, it's a good rule of thumb that when the seed is ripe, that's the time to sow it. Chrysogonum virginianum, the green and gold, very hard seed to collect, I find. Often difficult to find the seed pod, and the seed pods break apart very quickly and suddenly and unexpectedly. I've actually have successfully grown this from seed. And again, it's the same trick. The seed ripens up in the early summer. You sow it right away. And sometimes they'll even germinate by autumn as well. Again, it's an aster family member. And all of these spring aster family bloomers seem to germinate in the autumn the same year as flowering. Bloodroot, Sanguinary canadensis, just like with the trilliums that I think I'll show in a little bit, this is a pod. It's not really a fruit. Well, I guess technically it is a berry, I think. But in any case, the seeds are damp and oily, and they're best either sown right away or pack them, like I had mentioned a few times, pack them in wet sand and keep them in the refrigerator until autumn. Doll's eyes, Ectea pachypoda. This is actually a plant that ripens in the summertime, but those fruits will hang around for a good long time. This is one that I actually will treat more almost like an autumn sowing seed. Even though it's a spring blooming plant, the seeds don't really ripen until later. And so it doesn't follow the same rule of thumb. It's best to sow these guys in the autumn. Trilliums, just like the bloodroot, collect them up and sow them right away. Shooting stars, this is one that actually does pretty well. If you sit on it, you can store the seed of shooting star dry, and you can sow it in the autumn like you would autumn ripening seeds. Bophilia ciliata, this is another one. Now, mint family members in general don't have dormancy requirements. That includes bee balms and other things like that. They will germinate almost anytime you sow them. So if you collect the seeds in the summertime and sow them, they'll probably come up in the autumn. But you can also hold on to this seed dry. This one will actually store very well, and you can sow it in the autumn for spring germination. All right, autumn ripening seeds. Now, autumn ripening seeds are a lot of the easy ones. Now, this picture here shows two plants. Now, the thing with autumn ripening seeds is you can't always go by the time of year that the plant blooms. Like I mentioned before, that generally plants that bloom in the spring, those seeds ripen in the late spring, early summer. But some plants don't ripen for a really, really long time, like the doll's eyes, but also like the plant in this picture. This is Zizia aurea. It's the light yellow flower in this picture. That's an early blooming plant. It's blooming now for me. But the seed just stays green and green and green. It just does not ripen all the way up until August, September. Even though it's a spring blooming plant, the seed does not actually ripen until very late. And therefore, you should treat it as autumn ripening seed. You sow it in the autumn for spring germination. The milkweeds, Asclepias exaltata, again, a lot of these spring blooming milkweeds will have the same deal. The seed pods of the Asclepias exaltata just seem to stay green forever. They just take a really, really long time to ripen up, and you collect them in really almost September, October. You know, considering that it's a plant that is in bloom in June, that's a long period of time for them to go from flower to seed. All the spring blooming milkweeds are like that, though. Here's Asclepias quadrifolia, a little tiny milkweed. It's a great, cute little thing. Absolutely impossible to find in the autumn when you go out trying to find it again to collect seeds on it. But again, even though it blooms in May, those seed pods just stay green all the way up until September, October. Whitewood aster and asters in general, all of these plants, their seeds ripen up in the autumn. You can sow them, store them dry, and sow them in the fall for spring germination. Actaea racemosa, Monardas, lots of different species of bee balm, and like I said, mint family members like bee balm, they generally do not have a cold dormancy. So you could actually store these plants dry all the way up until, you know, March or April and sow them then. And they don't need that cold, wet period. They'll still germinate without it. Penstemons, great group of plants. Very easy to collect the seeds on these. The seeds on penstemon actually hold for a really long time. So you can collect penstemon seed right up into December even. Scutellaria incana. This is the hoary skullcap. Now I showed in the spring blooming example, the Scutellaria serrata, the showy skullcap, how that plant, the seeds ripened in groups of two at a time, slowly over weeks and weeks and weeks. That doesn't hold across all Scutellarias. The Scutellaria incana, the seeds ripen all at once. So you can actually go out there and collect the seeds in bulk all at one time. It's not one that you have to collect little bits in little dribs and drabs. Gentians. Gentians are difficult. I've actually found them easier to germinate than a lot of people say. The trick with gentian seeds is that you don't want to bury them too deep in the soil. Again, it's a surface sown seed. You want to top dress it very carefully on your soil, and then maybe very carefully dress it with some finely milled sphagnum and nothing else. The real problem with gentian, though, is that there's this little bug that gets into the seed pods and eats the seeds. So I actually have a hard time collecting good seed of gentian because it seems like there's always this little worm in the seed pod eating up all the seeds. And I have tried to identify that little worm for years and years and years now, and I can't find anyone who knows what the insect is that's eating the seeds of gentian. But it's really stymied me in the nursery trying to figure out how to collect seed on this plant because of it. Heucheras actually don't have a cold dormancy. Again, it's a tiny, tiny little seed, surface sown, and you can sow it in time and they'll germinate. Heuchera villosa, another heuchera, similar. Thaspium zizias, I had mentioned them earlier, again, as spring blooming plants whose seeds actually don't ripen until the autumn when you can go ahead and collect them up. Thaspium is an interesting plant. I really like Thaspium. It's a hard sell to some extent. It's kind of like Zizia, but not quite as showy. But what Thaspium has over Zizia is extreme drought tolerance. It's a plant that grows in really, really thin, flinty woodland soils. Unlike the Zizia, which loves to grow in rich creek edges and low-lying places. I really think that Thaspium is an undersung plant as a result. Let's see. Polygonatum commutatum, the giant Solomon seal. Again, fruit-bearing plants in the autumn. They're wet. They're moist seeds. So you collect those seeds in the autumn. You should sow them right away, or if you do store them, you can't store them dry. Again, pack them in damp sand, keep them in your refrigerator. Same with Aurelia racemosa, the spikenard. a plant that produces copious amounts of fruit, you can then actually press through a sieve or a colander really easily. And you can get tiny, tiny little black seeds that you can sow. Germinates really well too. Some thoughts on complex dormancy. Now, this is where a lot of people fall down because they don't realize which plants are double dormant or even triple dormant or have some other seasonality that they require. Virtually all ecteas and semicifugas are double dormant. If you sow the seeds of ectea, the doll's eyes, or semicifuga, the cohoshes, don't expect germination for 2 years. It takes 2 years. If you sow them in a seed flat, you need to keep that seed flat moist and weed free for 2 years in order for them to germinate. But people forget, they'll think the next spring, oh, it failed, and they'll get rid of it. You got to be patient with some of these plants. So ectea and semicifuga are examples of this. Chamaesyas psiloides is another one. Now this is one where if you store the seed dry and sow it in the autumn, it will take 2 years to germinate. But if you collect the seed in June and sow it right away, it will actually germinate the next spring. Clematis are also double dormant. Now that comes down to the fact that clematis seeds are kind of interesting. There's a seed, but then they're surrounded by this sort of achene, I guess you might call it, just like the way the seed of a maple is surrounded by another layer with a little wing on it. But in the case of clematis, that little layer and wing is fuzzy. Now, some people who grow clematis, I know, will actually split that and remove the seed from that. I find that extremely tedious for bulk propagation. It might take me all day to collect enough seed that way. But if you do that, then you can actually cut down germination to a single year. Instead, I prefer just to sow it and wait 2 years. For my clematises. Now, only the herbaceous clematises are double dormant. That's Clematis viorna, that's Clematis crispa, Clematis glaucophila, Clematis albicoma. All of the herbaceous clematises are double dormant. The woody clematises, that is Clematis virginiana and Clematis occidentalis, have a simple single season dormancy. So if it's a woody clematis, 1 winter is enough. If it's a herbaceous clematis, it needs 2 winters to germinate. Lilies actually are interesting. Lilies, what they do is the first year, it does take 2 years for lilies to germinate, but technically it doesn't. It takes 2 years for you to see top growth on lilies. What they do is the first summer after sowing, after they go through their first winter time, they'll germinate and produce what's called a protocorm. They'll actually drop little roots down into the soil and form a tiny little corm nugget. And then it'll just sit there until it goes through another wintertime. Then that wintertime will break the dormancy of the protocorm, and then it'll actually push up top growth, and you'll see a little green shoot come out. And then if you're patient, after 5 or 6 years, you'll actually get a blooming sized plant. So lilies actually are effectively double dormant, even though they technically germinate the first year. It's just that you don't see that happen. Now, that's only the Turk's cap type lilies, the Lilium canadensis, Lilium superbum, Lilium michoi, Lilium grayi. Those are the lilies that do that. On the other hand, all of the upward facing lilies like Lilium philadelphicum, and we have a few others, although they're a little rarer. These plants actually have a single season dormancy. So they will actually germinate, form their protocorms, and then grow the same year. So Lilium philadelphicum doesn't go through that whole 2-year process. It does everything in a single year. Superbum, I mentioned already, as one that goes through the 2-year process. Melanthrium, the bunch flower, this is a lily family relative. This also has a 2-year germination process. Triosteum auranticum, the wild coffee. Now this plant has a 3 to 4 year dormancy requirement. So I will sow a seed flat of wild coffee and I'll hold on to it for 3 to 4 years in order to find seed germination on that. So it seems to have to go through multiple back and forths between it being warm and warm and cold multiple times in order to break dormancy on this plant. And no amount of scarification, no amount of applying sandpaper to it or sulfuric acid or anything else ever seemed to change the fact that you just need to be patient with this plant in order for it to grow. So for all that, if you ever buy wild coffee, just remember that it took me years to get these plants to go. All right, some thoughts on sowing. I'm going to talk a little bit about how I think that you should prepare your sowing mediums. I'm going to talk first a little bit about, well, the potting media. One of the things with, well, I guess I'm going to talk about potting media first, then I'll talk about seed sowing media. What it comes down to is the coarseness of the material. I prefer to use for potting chunky, coarse material, like pine bark nuggets mixed with a standard growing soilless growing medium like ProMix or Proline. And then you can add sand, like coarse all-purpose sand, or if you look in the bottom center there. Don't use playground sand, it's too fine. You want to find coarse building sand. If you're going to mix that into your seed sowing material or into your potting mix or into anything you might use sand in. Peat moss, that's the top center is a good media if you want to make your own mix from scratch. If you don't want to use a pre-made mix, you can use this blended with sand or perlite, which is the material in the lower left. Perlite is a mined material that's mined in a mine, and then it's heated to high temperature to actually make the crystalline structure of the material open up. It's a volcanic deposit. It's getting to be fairly scarce, and I actually found this year that there's something of a perlite shortage. Perlite is actually becoming less and less sustainable, just like peat moss is becoming less and less sustainable. Now, in the upper right-hand corner, that block there is actually a compressed brick of coir. Now, coir is the husk of a coconut, which has been ground up and had the salt leached out of it and made into a peat-like substance that you can use in place of peat moss. And it works pretty well as a peat substitute, except that it's about 5 times more expensive than peat. But you know, a material like that should be more expensive than what the old easy standby that is becoming less and less sustainable. To be honest, sand is actually also becoming less sustainable. You know, bottom line is everything's becoming less sustainable the more I read into it. I've actually heard that there's a sand shortage as well. And you actually get these things out there called sand pirates, interestingly enough. Fertilizers, of course, compost in the upper left, that's composted leaves. I can't really use that in my plant production or seed sowing production because homemade compost can have beetle grubs in it, and I can't have any beetle grubs in my finished product. So I can't use homemade compost in my product line, but at home you certainly can. Other things that are great, organic materials such as plant tone, Milorganite, which is kind of an organic material if you think about it, technically not organic, but Milorganite is basically sewage that's been dried out, but it works pretty good as a fertilizer. Osmocote is a non-organic material, but it's a good slow release. I use that instead of the compost because I need a slow release in my mixes. And dolomitic lime, of course, is another thing that you need, because some of these plants like more or less limestone. You got to do a little bit of research to find out where these plants grow. If they grow in a place that has a lot of lime in the soil, then you might want to consider adding extra lime to your potting and seed sowing mixes. This is my homemade seed starting mix. This is what I use for making a seed starter. You know, a commercial, start with a commercial seed starting mix, a non-soil based seed starting mix. I'll use 2 parts of that, and then I'll add 1 part coarse sand or fine perlite. That's a very, very fine perlite. Excuse me, but I don't usually add fertilizers to a seed flat, just because young seedlings are very sensitive to fertilizer. If anything, I might add, you might add leaf compost. I don't add leaf compost for all the reasons I mentioned, but I might add something like a very, very small amount of Canton to the mix. Okay. This is my homemade potting mix. Again, you know, this is a propagation lecture, but you know, here's my version of a home potting material, just for your interest. It's similar. I like to start with a commercial peat-based mix, and then I add lots of pine bark to it. This is aged pine bark. And then plenty of perlite or coarse sand, and then the lime and some fertilizers to balance it out. I like to use bark. I don't really like straight commercial mixes. I think they're too waterlogging. They're too heavy. I find that my plants rot in it. Pine bark is the perfect amount of drainage, and it doesn't break down too quickly. So I find it works really great as a seed sowing and as a growing material. Flats, the upper left is a typical seed sowing flat you might get at like a Home Depot or something like that. They're okay for some things. I find that they're not deep enough and they're flexible. You know, one thing about particularly seeds that take multiple years to grow is that you really need a seed flat that is sturdy. Because believe it or not, over time, that flexibility, when the plant flexes, the soil tends to move and crack and open, and it just doesn't seem it causes disturbance to the seeds, and they just don't do as well. I like to use a little bit firmer of a seed flat. Either I'll build my own out of wood, or the one in the far upper right corner, that's a plastic seed flat that I buy from Anderson Plastics. That's come out of Oregon. It's a nice, firm, rigid seed flat. It's got no flexibility to it, and it's deep. It's almost 4 inches deep. And that works much better for a lot of the things that I sell, particularly long-term things like lilies and, of course, the wild coffee. Plugs, that's a plug tray in the lower left. Plugs I like okay for plants that don't like their roots to be disturbed. I find that milkweed seeds grow much better for me if I grow them in a plug flat rather than putting them in an open flat. Putting them in a plug flat, I can pop them right out, stick them in a pot. They grow much better than they would otherwise. Again, other sort of makeshift seed flats. The upper left is a wooden one that I built out of just lumber, used lumber. And they work really great. Another nice thing about a wooden seed flat is some seeds like to have fire applied to them. If you think about wildfires and how some seeds will come up after a wildfire, obviously you can't burn the soil in a plastic flat. You'll burn and melt your flat, but you can certainly burn the surface of the soil in a wooden seed flat. You just put some pine needles down and kind of create your own little miniature wildfire. That shallow barren buckwheat I showed you earlier is one that seems to really like it. Another plant that does really well after burning is New Jersey tea. I find that germination is much improved by creating a little artificial wildfire on it. The lower left, you'll see is a styrofoam container. That's a styrofoam container for grapes. And you can sometimes get these from grocery stores. They throw them away after a bit, or when they get new produce in. You can sometimes snag these. And then on the right-hand side, that's just a 3-gallon pot that I took a pair of heavy-duty scissors to, or an X-Acto blade, and just cut in half. It's a very thick, rigid 3-gallon pot, and then I cut it down to about 4 inches tall, and I had an instant seed flat. A wildflower, I wanted to show this again just because give you an example. This is a well, this was supposed to be a come on. This was supposed to be a video. Boy, none of my videos are playing for some reason. They were working before. This is my technique for burning a seed, like if I had a New Jersey tea or something like that. So after you've sowed the seeds, I like to wet the soil down really good with water, because you're not actually trying to set the surface of the soil on fire. You just want to get that kind of chemically, smoky ashiness into the soil and have a little bit of heat applied. So I'll wet down the flat in the container, partly so that the wood itself won't catch on fire, but also just so that there's some moisture in there. I'll top dress it with some leaves. Well, those are actually pine needles, a very thin layer of pine needles. Again, this is supposed to be a video, and it's not playing. Why won't it play? I don't know why it won't play. Well, picture that as a with the pine needles on there, and my taking a match to it and setting it on fire, and it just burns across the surface of the soil. Very low intensity fire. It imparts some chemicals into the soil from the ash and the smoke, and that seems to spur germination of a lot of plants. Here they are germinating a little while later. Another thing to think about is protection from critters. I like to, particularly when it comes to the wooden flats, this is another advantage to having a wooden flat, is I can cut out little pieces of hardware cloth and either lay them over the flat or staple them onto the flat. And this keeps chipmunks and squirrels from digging things out of there. You know, if I plant acorns in that seed flat, or other things that might attract small rodents. I've had them dig around in seed flats before. It also deters cats from using it as a litter pan, which I have also sometimes had. And if you have chickens, it keeps the chickens from getting up in there and scratching around in it as well. So yeah, I like to have a little collection of hardware cloth as a critter deterrence. Storage of seed flats that you sow in the summertime. So again, I mentioned a lot of these plants, they will appreciate being sowed for the summertime, but they won't germinate until the next spring. In the meantime, I'll just stash them away somewhere kind of dark where they can stay moist, but not too moist. And I'll top dress them thickly with pine needles. And that'll keep them just kind of in a state of stasis until the following spring. I wouldn't do this for those plants that will germinate in the autumn. You know, I wouldn't do this for the Antenaria or the Senecio or any of those spring blooming asters that I mentioned that they germinate in late summer or autumn. Obviously, in those cases, you don't want to put them aside. You want to treat them as active seed flats. Winter storage, this is actually the old nursery. And again, all I do is put the seed flats out in a sheltered spot for the winter, cover the whole thing over in pine needles, and I might put a frost blanket on top of that, and I'll leave them out there to be frozen all winter long until springtime. If you've got a greenhouse, bring them in March and I'll start warming them up. Otherwise, once the weather starts to warm, just uncover everything and leave them outside to germinate. Here they are being brought inside the greenhouse to start germinating in early spring or late winter. That's actually my old glass greenhouse in West Virginia. This is my new greenhouse in Floyd, which actually has a heater in it, unlike the old one, which means I can get things germinating. And if there's a cold snap, they won't automatically all die. You can also do this in a cold frame. Cold frames are very inexpensive and easy to build. Or you can get a little greenhouse, one of those sort of quick frame pop-up greenhouses. They work really well as well for small scale germination projects. A few thoughts on asexual propagation before we end here. You know, cloning kind of has a bad rap right now in terms of the native plant movement. Everybody wants seed grown, but a lot of plants are not easily grown from seed, or they're not very quick. From a production standpoint, it really works better to do them asexually. And some of them are really easy. Mehania cordata, the Meehan's mint, I have never seen seed on this plant. It must produce seed, but I've never been able to find it. But it germinate, or it will root readily. And I find it really easy to just go in there and cut little pieces of it. And even in a garden, I'll cut a little piece and I'll just move it somewhere and put a rock on top of it. In fact, I think I have a picture of that. Yeah, there it is. There's a little piece of Mehania that I cut off from the parent, and I just laid it on the surface of the ground and put a rock on top of it. It germinates in about, I mean, not germinate, I keep saying germinates. It roots in about 2 or 3 weeks. Easy. And now I've got a whole bunch of new plants for essentially nothing. Iris cristata, the crested iris. This is another one that you can easily do the same way. The seeds of Iris cristata are really hard to collect. It frequently doesn't even produce seed. Or if it does, it's very difficult to find the seed pods. So I find it much easier to clip these guys, because in the pots, you can see how they grow out over the edge of my pots. And you can see if you look at the tip, and at the very bottom there, they're already trying to grow roots. So they already kind of come rooted. All you got to do is clip them off and stick them in some soil and they'll root right in. New plant. There's a little styrofoam tray that I made of a whole bunch of clippings of Iris cristata at the nursery. And that rooting mix is basically a 50-50 mix of perlite and peat. That's all it is. Some people use pure perlite, some people use pure sand. I like a 50-50 peat perlite mix though for rooting. And that's a rooting chamber. That's basically a sealed box kept out of direct sunlight. And after I make these little cuttings, I'll stick that in there, and I'll just take the top off every so often and mist them, keep it kind of moist in there. And after 2 or 3 weeks, they're rooted enough, I can take them out of the rooting chamber. And that's all. I guess we'll do some questions. Are there questions? I see 3 things in the chat here. No, not really. Will vermiculite work like perlite? Someone asked if vermiculite will act like perlite. No, it's different. They're different materials. Vermiculite is fine. It's a very fine material. It works a little bit like perlite, but it doesn't have as much, it doesn't impart as much drainage as perlite does. Perlite has a lot more surface area. It holds moisture, but also allows for drainage. The chick grit, yeah, chick grit works really nicely as well for for top dressing and growing things in and separating chaff. Would it be easier to propagate bluebells by division? You know, I find bluebell seeds to germinate so easily that I can make a million new ones much quicker than I can by digging up a plant, cutting the root up, and then burying it again. I mean, it's not hard to do either way, but for me, in terms of bulk production, I just find it easier to do it by seed. I get more. I'm just looking at the chat right now. Are there questions in other locations? I don't see a question and answer thing here anywhere.
I don't think so. I think that, let me see. Bruce asked, do you find Baptisia growing wild in our area?
I never have. Now, it's not far away. Baptisia well, let me qualify that. Baptisia australis grows in the New River Valley, but I'm not sure where in Virginia. I've never seen it in Virginia, but I have collected and seen it growing along the New River and Greenbrier rivers in West Virginia. Now, the other Baptisia, the one that really is kind of common around here, is Baptisia tinctoria. That's the little yellow Baptisia. And you can see that in all kinds of places. That's growing at Falls Ridge Preserve. I'm sure it's growing in Wildwood and Radford. It grows in a lot of dry places all around the area. That one's not at all uncommon.
Okay.
The other Baptisia that is sort of in the area-ish, but not really, is Baptisia albescens, the southern white indigo. I've never seen it in Virginia. I've actually never seen it in the wild, but I think it gets up kind of into North Carolina, maybe some parts of Virginia out towards Danville, maybe.
Todd says, it's an amazing talk. And he says, with milkweed seeds, he puts them in a jar with dry sand, and then he shakes them, and that separates the fluff from the seeds.
Yeah, that works too. I'll tell you that using a match is a lot more fun and faster. I mean, it's faster.
And Beth says, I think she put this up when you were talking about the mixes the seed mixes that you put up, and you were mentioning the coarse sand, and she said fine chick grit works well too.
Yeah.
Is that right, Beth?
Yeah, chicken grit's good. Yeah, that works. That works. Chicken grit is often made of limestone or crushed oyster shells. Sometimes you got to watch that, you know, for long term, because you'll end up with an extremely calcareous rich soil.
Ian, the ones the chick grit that we get locally is actually granite from North Carolina.
Granite.
And so
Okay.
the guy I work with at one of the nurseries looked into it, and he said that granite tended to be a little bit acidic. But I sometimes do use limestone dust on plants that, you know, would take that limestone.
Yeah. Okay.
It sounds, David Jenkins is saying, would it be easier to propagate bluebells by division?
Yeah, I mentioned, I think I answered that one already.
Oh, okay, sorry.
I find division, it's fine, but it means digging up the plant, and it means chopping it up, and I don't know. I find seed to be pretty easy, and you can get a lot more. I see somebody here asking about asters, growing asters from seed, and how to overwinter them to plant out the next spring. I'm going to assume that you mean that the seed is already germinated and you've got some plants and you want to know how to overwinter them. And I would say that if you don't want to plant them right away and you want to wait another year, do the same thing I showed with the seed flats. Just bury everything in a nice layer of pine needles or leaves. Cover it with a frost blanket if you think you need to, and just let them stay there until next winter. I mean next spring, and then plant them.
What percentage of seed from one plant should you collect? What percentage?
Depends on where the plant is. If it's your own plant, collect as much of it as you want. If it's from your own garden or your own place. If I'm collecting from a wild location, again, it's going to depend on the situation. I don't think that for me, I would never need generally to collect more than 10% or so of an amount of seed to get what I need. But then once I have the plant in my nursery, I prefer to collect from in the nursery, and then I can collect all I want, as much as I want. But if you're out like at a field and if you're collecting little blue stem, heck, collect all of that you want. No, you're not going to do any damage collecting little blue stem seeds. But I mean, if you're collecting some weird rare thing, well, I'm not sure you should collect that at all. So it kind of runs the spectrum.
Brenda says, do not collect seed from federal, state, or local parks, and get permission from private property owners.
Yeah, you'll definitely get in trouble if you're collecting, especially from federal land. But any public land that's not a place for you to collect. At least not without permits. You can get permits to make collections, but I will say that it is frequently not easy to get those permits.
Okay. And Carol wants to know, where do you do your seed collecting from?
There's some private properties that I had collected over the years, but also remember, I inherited this nursery from a previous owner who had done a lot of, over the last 25 years or so, had done a bunch of collecting, and I've got a lot of this stuff is just in the nursery now, and I collect probably the bulk of my seed from within the nursery itself. Other places that I will collect, a few private properties, and then there's a couple of roadsides and power line right-of-ways that I'll do collection on. I kind of treat, even though technically those are also public locations, roadways and highway and power line right-of-ways and pipeline right-of-ways are so frequently herbicided anymore that I think that those plants are under such risk of destruction that I don't find collecting from those places to be particularly troublesome to me.
Okay, Lucinda says, similar to Brenda's nylons, she uses silk tea bags with cut corner and safety pins to capture green seed pod of the wood poppy. When they pop open, they're captured.
Yeah. You can use that's definitely a good technique. You can also buy these little muslin drawstring bags, but it doesn't work in every case. Some of those seed pods are very upright, and when the seeds pop, they just kind of tumble down to the opening and they'll slip out unless you're there to collect them. Spigelia seeds, for instance, you notice that the seed stalks are very stiff and upright, and so when you put the bag over the top of that, it's basically upright with the opening, the drawstring opening or whatever opening at the bottom, which means that there's a tendency for the seeds to kind of work their way down to the bottom and then eventually sort of work their way out.
And how do you avoid doing that for the seeds to escape?
For me, I go out there every day and just collect the seeds in 2s and 3s until I have enough.
And David says, what is a good reference for information on propagating with seeds? I can say that Prairie Moon Nursery online has information about how to propagate native plants.
Yeah, they're pretty good, especially, of course, with the sun prairie type plants. There is some good, there are a lot of good propagation books out there, and I can't think off the top of my head which ones I would recommend, because it's been such a long time since I've actually consulted them myself, since I pretty much have my own personal techniques. But if you just Google native plant seed propagation book, you're going to turn up a couple dozen probably. Let me think if there's something handy here that jumps out at me. Hold on a second. This one is not super easily acquirable. This is a private publication, but I think you can get them from Birmingham Botanic Gardens. It's a book on native plant propagation published by Jan Midgley. That's Midgley. And she has really good propagation material techniques on a lot of lesser well-known plants. She's from Alabama, so she has a little bit more of a southern focus, but like she'll tell you how to propagate, things like weird clematises and hollies and, things like that. It's not hexastylus and jack-in-the-pulpits and things. Anyway, it's a good little publication, but there are other, let me think, one that I got years ago when I first started. That's Growing and Propagating Wildflowers by Harry Phillips. And this one actually has some really good information in it, both for seeds and for cutting propagation. I think this is, here's a good one on fire pinks. And I think his technique for germinating fire pinks is the one that I eventually adopted myself.
I have a copy of that book, and I really like that.
Yeah, there's a lot of good books out there. Yeah.
Ian, do you want to tell the people about the delivery this Saturday then?
Yes. So if you want to place orders online, I'm going to be coming into Blacksburg this Saturday afternoon to drop off orders all around Blacksburg. So if you can get your orders in before the end of the week, then I can bring those orders Saturday afternoon. It's going to be at Saturday afternoon, probably Saturday afternoon, maybe into Sunday morning to get them all out, depending on how many orders come in. I have a few that I need to take into Blacksburg, Christiansburg area already. Yeah. Anyway, yeah, just get them in and make sure that you put in the, it's going to ask you to add a note at the end of your order. And when it asks for the note, make sure you put in, NRV native plant lecture, so that I know it's in reference to this, this particular lecture.
And
lastly, I just want to also say, it's been an extremely, extremely busy year or two since last year and this year. If you go to the website, you're going to see that there's a lot of stuff not available. And it's just because I can't keep up with the demand right now. So I do apologize for the fact that it looks a little empty and vacant in terms of availability, but I just, people have just been buying and buying and buying, and I can't keep up. So, someone is asking here also about putting the reference in the chat box. I can say that, let's see here, it's it just is titled native. W. Now let's see, and it's published. It's a personal publication. Let's see. This was done in 2013. There's an email here. I would be surprised if this email is still active, though. I think you might do better to contact the Birmingham Botanic Gardens. I think they have a bunch of these on just kind of on hand that you can buy for, I think, a relatively reasonable amount of money. Blacksburg may be a zoo. Graduations, yeah, that might be a bit of an obstacle, but you know, I'm so pressed for time. Saturday and Sunday is what it's going to be. So, yeah. Anybody have anything else?
And if you need gas, Randy just came back from filling both our cars up. And he said, if you need gas, you better go get it. Like 50 cars in the line.
Wow.
I need to be able to go to North Carolina a week from Sunday, and I couldn't take a chance of not having the gas.
Well, thank you, Ian,
right, well,
for this talk. So it's always very good each year in that. So we learn quite a bit from it in that.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks for having me. And I guess I'll see some of you guys when I deliver your plants, and I'll be in touch. And, you know, feel free to come out to the nursery too. I'm open Wednesdays and Sundays from 1 to 5 for just kind of walk-in traffic. You know, I'm fully vaccinated. You know, so it shouldn't be a problem with that, you know, as long as there's not a ton of other people there. Yeah, thank you.
And this has been recorded and will be put up on our YouTube channel within a few days then. And if somebody missed it, then you can go and watch it there then.
All right. Well, thank you very much, everyone, and good night.
Okay.
And,
Good night,
hold on.
everybody. And
Thanks.
remember our June
Thank
8th
you.
meeting then for how to choose a good garden sign. So I hope to see you there too then. Okay, good night.